He was a ghost in a suit. He did not stalk his victims from the shadows of alleyways, he wooed them under the spinning disco balls of the Barrowland Ballroom. He was handsome, well-spoken, and quoted scripture while his hands prepared to kill. In late 1960s Glasgow, 3 young mothers went out for a night of dancing and never came home. They were strangled with their own stockings, left in the cold, damp doorways of the city. The only witness was a sister who shared a terrifying taxi ride with the killer, a man who railed against adulterous women before vanishing into the night. They called him Bible John. And for over 50 years he has remained Scotland's deepest, darkest secret. This is not just a cold case. It is a hunt for a phantom that has haunted a city for generations. The stage, Glasgow, 1968. To understand the darkness of Bible John, you first must understand the vibrant, gritty pulse of Glasgow in the late 1960s. While London was swinging and San Francisco was celebrating the summer of love, Glasgow was a city of hard industry and harder living. It was a place of tenements, shipyards, and a fog that seemed to cling to the River Clyde like a bruise. But on Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday nights, the grey lifted. The epicenter of escapism was the Barrowland Ballroom. Barrowland was not just a dance hall, it was a cathedral of romance. The neon sign buzzed above the Gallowgate, promising glamour to a working-class generation. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, the scent of cheap perfume and hairspray. A live band played covers of the Beatles and the Stones. If you were young in Glasgow, this is where you went to find love, or at least a distraction from the grind. It was a meat market in the local parlance, a place to see and be seen. But beneath the music, there was a vulnerability. In 1968, women's liberation was a headline, not a reality for many. It was a time when young women, particularly young mothers, were expected to stay home. Those who went out dancing, especially those who were separated or single mothers, were often judged. This social stigma would become the killer's camouflage. The first shadow, Patricia Docker. The terror began on February 23, 1968. Patricia Docker was 25 years old. She was a nurse, a profession of care and empathy. But beneath the uniform, she was a woman carrying the weight of a crumbling marriage. She had separated from her husband and was living back home with her parents in Langside, raising her young son. On this specific night, Patricia just wanted to be Pat again. She wanted to feel young. She told her parents she was going to the majestic ballroom, perhaps to avoid their judgment about the rougher crowd at the Barrowland. But Barrowland is where she went. Imagine her that night, wearing a yellow dress and a duffel coat, laughing with friends, perhaps feeling a rare moment of freedom. She met a man. They danced. The next morning, a bitter frost covered the city. A man on his way to work found a body in a lock-up garage doorway just yards from Patricia's home. She had been stripped naked, her clothes piled neatly nearby. She had been raped and strangled. The police investigation was marred by the moral rigidity of the time. When it was revealed she was a separated mother out dancing, the tone of the inquiry shifted. The press was quiet, the police were baffled. Without DNA, without CCTV, the trail went cold almost immediately. The second shadow, Jemima MacDonald. 18 months later, the city had largely forgotten the nurse in the yellow dress. But the predator had not. August 16, 1969. Jemima MacDonald, 32, was a mother of 3. Like Patricia, she was a regular at the Barrowland. Jemima was described by those who knew her as full of life, a woman who loved to dance and refused to let her circumstances as a single mother define her. On that Saturday night, the atmosphere at the Barrowland was electric. Jemima was seen leaving the hall around midnight. She was not alone. Witnesses described a tall, slim man with reddish-fair hair walking her towards the bus stop. The tragedy of Jemima's death is in the proximity to safety. She made it back to her building. Her sister, Margaret, heard footsteps on the stairs that night but assumed it was just Jemima coming home with a date. She went back to sleep. The next day, Jemima was found in a derelict tenement building right next door to her own home. She had been strangled with her own stockings. She was menstruating at the time, a detail that the police would later realize was a crucial trigger for the killer's rage. Panic began to set in. Two women, both mothers, both met at the Barrowland, both strangled. The newspapers began to connect the dots, but the killer was just getting started. The third shadow, Helen Puttock. If the first two murders were tragedies, the third was the one that gave the monster his name. October 30th, 1969. Halloween was approaching, and the nights were drawing in long and dark. Helen Puttock, 29, was married with two children. Her husband was stationed elsewhere with the army, leaving Helen feeling isolated. That night, she went to the Barrowland with her sister, Jean Langford. The two sisters were close, looking out for one another in the crowded hall. They met two men. Both were named John. One John, Castle Milk John, drifted away after the dance. The other John stayed. This man was different. He was well-dressed in a suit from Reed & Taylor, a high-end tailor. He was polite, articulate, and did not smell of alcohol. He called himself John Templeton, or perhaps Semple. At the end of the night, the trio, Helen, her sister Jean, and this mysterious John, hailed a taxi. This taxi ride is the most chilling 15 minutes in Scottish criminal history. Jean sat in the back. Helen and John sat together. As the taxi rattled through the cobblestone streets, the conversation took a dark turn. John began to speak about religion. He quoted the Old Testament. He spoke of Moses. He criticized the morals of the city. At one point, he referenced the Barrowland, calling it an adulterous den of iniquity. Jean, sensing the strange vibe, asked him if he was religious. He replied, "I don't drink at Hogmanay. I pray." Jean was dropped off first. She watched the taillights of the taxi fade into the fog, taking her sister and the man who quoted the Bible away. It was the last time she saw Helen alive. The next morning, Helen Puttock was found in the back garden of her Earl Street flat, strangled. Her stockings were missing. She, too, had been menstruating. The killer had placed a sanitary napkin under her arm, a bizarre, ritualistic signature. The aftermath, a city in fear. By November 1969, Glasgow was a city under siege. The press dubbed him Bible John. The composite sketch released by the police, based on Jean's description, became the face of fear. It showed a man with short, reddish hair, slightly overlapping front teeth, and a piercing stare. Women stopped going out. Sales of door locks skyrocketed. The Barrowland, once the heart of the city, became a place of suspicion. Every man in a suit, every man who quoted a psalm, every man with a gap in his teeth was a suspect. The police launched one of the biggest manhunts in British history. They interviewed over 50,000 men. They infiltrated dance halls undercover. But the man in the suit, the man who prayed before he prayed, had vanished into the smoke of the city he despised. 3 mothers were dead, and the legend of Bible John was born. The dance of death. To understand the crime, we must step inside the noise. It is October 30th, 1969. Inside the Barrowland Ballroom, the heat is suffocating. It is a sensory overload. The brass section of the band is blaring a cover of Obladi Oblada. The floor is vibrating under hundreds of pairs of heels and leather shoes, and the air is a thick haze of tobacco smoke. In the middle of this chaos stands the predator. Unlike the other men there, rough-handed shipyard workers or drunk students spilling lager, this man is composed. He is a study in control. He is wearing a single-breasted, heather-mix suit, cut from expensive cloth. His shirt is crisp, his tie is knotted with military precision. He stands at roughly 5'10". He has reddish-fair hair, cut short in a style that feels slightly outdated for 1969, more 1950s conservative. He watches. He is not looking for the loudest girl or the drunkest. He is looking for a specific type. Dark hair. Maternal. Perhaps a hint of sadness in the eyes. He finds Helen Puttock. The assessment. Helen is 29, wearing a black dress that catches the ballroom lights. She is there with her sister, Jean. They are a protective unit, a fortress of two. This usually deters predators, but this man, let us call him by the name he gave, John, is confident. He approaches with a polite, almost old-world charm. He does not offer a cheesy pickup line. He introduces himself. He introduces his acquaintance, another man named John, later known as Castlemilk John, who is merely a pawn in this game, a buffer to make the approach seem safe. They dance. Witnesses would later say John moved well, but he held himself stiffly. He did not drink alcohol. While the rest of Glasgow was getting rowdy, he was sipping a soft drink, his mind razor-sharp. As the night winds down, the safe John, Castlemilk John, heads for his bus. The predator sees his opening. He offers to escort the sisters home. It seems like a gentlemanly gesture. It is, in fact, the beginning of the hunt. The taxi ride, a mobile confessional. They hail a taxi. This is where the mask begins to slip. Imagine the interior of that cab. The vinyl seats are cold. The city lights streak past in blur of orange and gray. Jean sits in the back, while Helen and John squeeze together. The physical proximity is intimate, yet the atmosphere turns icy. The conversation starts normally enough. They talk about the trade unions. They talk about the city. But then John pivots. It is not a gradual shift, it is a sudden lurch into darkness. He begins to talk about the filth of the city. He points out the window at the younger generation, sneering at their morals. He speaks of the adulterous women who frequent the dance halls, the very hall he just left. Jean, sensing the sudden intensity, tries to lighten the mood. She mentions the local golf course. John turns to her. His teeth are bared in a strange grimace. His front teeth overlap, a distinctive imperfection in an otherwise polished facade. He says, "I don't play golf. I don't see the point in chasing a ball into a hole." The way he says, hole, feels heavy, loaded with a disgust that has nothing to do with sports. Then the Bible comes out. Not a physical book, but verses. He recites them from memory, weaving Old Testament wrath into casual conversation. He references Moses. He speaks of punishment. Jean asks, "Are you a religious man, John?" He looks at her, his eyes dead flat. "I don't drink at Hogmanay," he says, referencing Scotland's biggest party of the year. "I pray." The taxi stops at Knightswood to drop Jean off. The sisters exchange a look. It is a look that haunts Jean for the rest of her life. Is this guy okay? But he is well-dressed. He is sober. He quotes the Bible. Surely he's safe. The door slams. The taxi pulls away with Helen and John inside. The witness is gone. The ritual begins. The taxi drops them near Helen's flat on Earl Street in Scotstown. It is roughly 1:30 a.m. The street is silent, the fog dampening sound. We do not know exactly what was said in those final moments, but based on the crime scene, forensic psychologists have reconstructed the terrifying switch. They walk toward her building. Maybe he tries to kiss her. Maybe she resists. Or maybe the mere fact that she is a married woman who went dancing is enough to trigger his divine judgment. But there is a biological trigger too. Helen is menstruating. For this killer, this seems to be the catalyst for an explosion of psychosexual rage. In his twisted theology, this natural function is proof of uncleanliness. The violence is sudden and overwhelming. He attacks her in the back court of the tenement, a dark, shared garden space. There is a struggle, vividly marked by the bruising on her face. He punches her, shattering her teeth. Then the strangulation. He does not use a rope or a weapon he brought with him. He uses her own stocking. This is the intimate, tactile kill of a strangler. It takes minutes. It requires him to look into her eyes as the light leaves them. He is close enough to feel her breath stop. The ritual. Once she is dead, the rage dissipates, replaced by a cold, clinical order. He does not flee in a panic. He stays. He manipulates the body. He places a sanitary napkin near or on the body, a gesture that baffles police. Is it a mark of shame? A bizarre attempt at modesty? Or a sign of his disgust? He arranges her clothing. In the case of Patricia Docker, the clothes were folded. With Helen, the scene is chaotic but the theft is specific. He takes her handbag. But it is not for money. It is a trophy. A memento of the sinner he has cleansed. Then the phantom walks away. He likely has scratches on his face. His knuckles might be bruised. He is walking through a residential neighborhood in the dead of night, covered in the invisible residue of violence. But he walks calmly. He catches a bus or walks the miles back to the south side of the city, blending into the shadows. By the time the sun rises and a neighbor walking their dog finds Helen's broken body in the wet grass, John is gone. He has returned to his life, his suit back in the wardrobe, his Bible back on the nightstand, waiting for the next time the urge to preach takes hold. The impossible task. The morning after Helen Puttock was found, the Glasgow City Police launched what would become one of the most extensive and expensive manhunts in British criminal history. Leading the charge was Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie. Beattie was a legendary figure in Glasgow, a hard-nosed, chain-smoking investigator who knew the city's underbelly like the back of his hand. To him, this was not just a case, it was personal. A man was walking his streets, quoting scripture, and slaughtering women. But Beattie had a problem. He was hunting a man who was utterly average in appearance yet completely unique in behavior. The golden witness and the face. The investigation hinged on one person, Jean Langford, Helen's sister. She was the only person to have looked Bible John in the eye, heard his voice, and survived. She sat with police sketch artist Lennox Patterson. Together, they created the image that would become the stuff of nightmares. The hair, reddish fair, short back and sides. The build, slim, roughly 5 feet 10 inches. The teeth, the crucial detail. The upper right front tooth overlapped the left. It was a distinctive, jagged smile. The police printed thousands of these flyers. They were plastered on every lamp-post, every bus stop, and every dance hall entrance in Scotland. Undercover on the dance floor. Beattie knew the killer's hunting ground, the Barrowland. In a move that sounds like a movie script, Beattie sent young detectives undercover into the ballroom. Imagine burly Glasgow coppers, uncomfortable in trendy clothes, trying to blend in with the swinging 60s crowd, their eyes scanning the room not for a pretty girl, but for a man with overlapping teeth. They were not just looking, they were listening. They were waiting for someone to mention Moses. Someone to refuse a drink at the bar. The Castlemilk John breakthrough. Early in the investigation, the police scored a massive victory, or so they thought. They tracked down the other John from that night, the man who had been with Bible John and the sisters but left early. His name was John White, known as Castlemilk John. He was terrified. He admitted to being there. He admitted to meeting the stranger. But he knew nothing. He had met Bible John casually at the dance. However, his testimony was vital. He confirmed Jean's story. He confirmed the suspect gave the name John Templeton, or Semple. He confirmed the man was well-dressed and quoted the Bible. This proved Jean had not hallucinated the man. He was real. The dental dragnet. Desperate for a lead, Beattie focused on the teeth. It was the only physical deformity they had. Police visited dentists across Scotland. They pored over thousands of dental records looking for a man with that specific overlap. Beattie even carried a plastic card with a cutout of the teeth formation in his pocket. If a suspect was brought in, Beattie would physically check their mouth. Over 5,000 suspects were interviewed in the first year alone. Men were pulled from their homes because they looked like the sketch. Men were arrested because they read the Bible. But every lead turned to ash. The red herring. The body in the grave. The case went cold for decades, freezing in time like the city itself. But in 1996, science offered a glimmer of hope. DNA. Semen stains found on Helen Puttock's tights had been preserved. With new technology, police believed they could finally unmask the monster. Their sights turned to a man named John Irvine McInnes. McInnes was a cousin of one of the original suspects. He had committed suicide in 1980. He fit the description. He had been at the Barrowland. In a dramatic turn of events, the police ordered the exhumation of McInnes's body. It was a media circus. Under the glare of floodlights, the grave was opened. The result? Inconclusive. The DNA was a partial match, enough to keep him as a suspect but not enough to convict. The family of McInnes was furious, claiming he was scapegoated. The Crown Office eventually declared there was insufficient evidence to link him to the crimes. The breakthrough had crumbled. The modern twist, Peter Tobin. Just when the public thought the case was dead, A new monster emerged in the 2000s. Peter Tobin was a convicted serial killer, known for burying his victims in homes across the UK. When his past was unraveled, the timeline sent shivers through the cold case unit. Tobin lived in Glasgow in the late 60s. He frequented the Barrowland. He was a staunch religious hypocrite who used aliases. He had moved out of Glasgow to Brighton right after the murder stopped. And most chillingly, a prison photograph of a young Tobin bore a striking resemblance to the Bible John sketch. Was Bible John Peter Tobin all along? Had they caught him 40 years too late? Operation Anagram was launched to investigate Tobin's life. But there was a problem. The DNA from the Puttock crime scene had degraded. Jean Langford, the only witness, had passed away, though she reportedly said Tobin did not look like the man she remembered. Tobin died in prison in 2022, taking his secrets to the grave. He denied being Bible John until his last breath. The psychological toll. The investigation left wreckage in its wake. Detective Joe Beattie retired without ever closing the case. It is said he kept the file on his desk until his last day, the face of the man with the overlapping teeth haunting him. The community of Glasgow changed too. The innocence of the dance hall was gone. The dancing murders had taught a generation of women that the devil does not have horns. He has a nice suit and a charming smile. Profile of a paradox. Inside the mind of Bible John. To catch a killer, you must understand why they kill. But Bible John defied the standard profile of a sexual predator. Most sexual killers are disorganized, impulsive, or socially awkward. Bible John was none of these things. He was the gentleman killer. Psychologists who have studied the case for decades point to a terrifying pathology known as the Madonna whore complex. In John's mind, women were split into two categories: the pure, untouchable saints, like the Virgin Mary, or perhaps his own mother, and the fallen women who frequented dance halls. He did not hate women, he was obsessed with them. But his desire was at war with a rigid, fundamentalist upbringing. When he felt attraction, he felt shame. And instead of dealing with that shame, he projected it onto the women who made him feel it. The scriptural shield, quoting the Bible, was not just a quirk, it was his justification. By reciting verses about adulterous women and sin, he was elevating himself. He was not a murderer in his own eyes. He was an instrument of divine wrath. He was cleansing the city. The menstruation trigger. This is the darkest, most primal aspect of his psychology. In the Old Testament, Leviticus, menstruation is deemed unclean. For a man obsessed with biblical purity, discovering his victims were menstruating likely triggered a disgust so violent it overrode his gentleman persona. It transformed the sexual act into a punishment. The placement of the sanitary pads was not random, it was a message. Look at your shame. The victims, the guilt of the innocent. We must also look at the psychology of the victims, and specifically, the burden placed upon them by society. Patricia, Jemima, and Helen were not reckless. They were women navigating a changing world. They were mothers who loved their children but craved a few hours of autonomy. In 1969 Glasgow, a woman alone in a ballroom was viewed with suspicion. This social stigma played right into the killer's hands. He targeted women who might feel a subtle sense of guilt for being out. When he spoke of adultery and sin, he was pressing on a bruise that society had already inflicted. Imagine the psychological terror of those final moments. These women were strangled with their own stockings, symbols of their femininity turned into weapons. The betrayal was absolute. The charming man who bought them a drink, who walked them home to keep them safe, became their executioner. The witness, the survivor's burden. Jean Langford, Helen's sister, carried the heaviest psychological weight of all. She is the classic case of survivor's guilt. Why did he let her go? Why did he drop her off first? Jean spent the rest of her life replaying that taxi ride. Every word John spoke about Moses, every glance he gave her sister, every second of that journey was scrutinized in her nightmares. She was the only person to see the face of the devil and live to describe it. The fear that he might come back for the loose end must have been suffocating. The detective, the obsession of Joe Beattie. Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie was the quintessential tragic hero. He was not just doing a job, he was hunting a personal nemesis. Beatty was known to have a photographic memory for faces. He would walk through the Barrowland Ballroom night after night, staring into the eyes of thousands of men, waiting for a spark of recognition. The psychological toll on Beatty was immense. He felt he had failed the women of Glasgow. The fact that the killer was so distinct, the teeth, the Bible quotes, the suit, yet remained invisible, gnawed at Beatty's sanity. It was not just a cold case, it was a taunt. He retired a broken man, the phantom of Bible John forever standing just out of his reach. The community, a city in shadow. Finally, there is the collective psychology of Glasgow itself. Before Bible John, the Barrowland was a place of joy. After, it became a place of suspicion. The murders introduced a low-level hum of paranoia to the city. Women looked at their husbands differently. Does he have a temper? Does he quote scripture too intensely? Men looked at each other differently. Is my neighbor the one? The dancing murders changed the social contract of the city. It taught a generation that safety was an illusion, and that the man holding the door open for you might be holding a death sentence in his other hand. The trail goes cold, then weird. By the early 1970s, the official trail of Bible John had frozen over. The dance halls remained open, the music played on, but the man in the suit had seemingly evaporated. However, in the silence, strange new theories began to grow like weeds. The public, desperate for an answer, began to whisper that the police were not just failing, they were being outsmarted. Or worse, they were protecting one of their own. Twist 1. The man with the badge. One of the most persistent and chilling theories to emerge was that Bible John was a police officer. Think about it. He knew how to clean a crime scene. He knew where the police patrols would be. He remained calm under pressure. He blended in. The theory gained traction when a police warrant card was found near the site of the third murder. It belonged to a serving officer. The police quickly dismissed it, claiming it had been dropped days earlier on an unrelated call. But for the conspiracy theorists, this was the smoking gun. Was the reason Joe Beatty could not catch him because the killer was sitting in the canteen, drinking tea with the very men hunting him? This theory cast a long shadow. It turned the police force from heroes into suspects. It suggested that Bible John was not a ghost, he was the law. Twist 2. The Grave Diggers, 1996. Fast forward almost 30 years. The case is a relic. But then, a scientist finds a speck of biological hope. A semen stain on Helen Puttock's tights had been preserved. The police narrow their sights on a man who had been interviewed back in 1969, John Irvine McInnes. McInnes was a furniture salesman, a job that required a suit. He had been a regular at the Barrowland. He was the cousin of the other John, Castle Milk John. And most suspiciously, he had committed suicide in 1980, severing his own timeline. In a dramatic midnight operation in 1996, police cordoned off a cemetery in Stonehouse, South Lanarkshire. Under the glare of floodlights, they exhumed McInnes's body. The city held its breath. This was it. The moment of truth. The twist? The science failed. The DNA sample was inconclusive. It was not a match, but it was not a match. The sample was too degraded. The Crown Office declared there was insufficient evidence to charge a dead man. The family of McInnes was outraged, their loved one branded a monster without the ability to defend himself. The hope of a resolution crumbled into dust. Twist 3. The Serial Killer Next Door, 2006. Just when Scotland thought the nightmares were over, a real-life boogeyman was caught. Peter Tobin. In 2006, Tobin was arrested for the brutal murder of Angelica Cluck in a Glasgow church. As police dug into his past, they found bodies buried in homes he had lived in across the UK. He was a sadistic sexual predator. The twist? Tobin lived in Glasgow in 1969. He was the right age. He looked exactly like the photo fit of Bible John. He used aliases. He hated women. He was a religious hypocrite. It seemed too perfect. The puzzle pieces finally snapped together. Detectives were convinced Tobin was Bible John. They launched Operation Anagram to prove it. But then came the counter twist. Jean Langford, the only eyewitness, was shown a picture of Tobin. She shook her head. That's not him, she said. The teeth are wrong. The height is wrong. Even worse, DNA technology had advanced, but the sample from 1969 had degraded even further due to the previous testing. They could not link him physically. Tobin died in prison in 2022, refusing to confess to the Bible John murders, taking the truth, if he had it, to the grave. Twist 4. The ultimate deception. In recent years, a final, mind-bending theory has emerged, championed by modern investigators and a BBC podcast series. What if Bible John never existed? Hear me out. This is the twist that shatters the entire story. We know 3 women were murdered. We know they were strangled. But were they killed by the same man? Patricia Docker, no witnesses. No description. Jemima MacDonald, a witness saw a man, but did not hear him speak. Helen Puttock, this is the only case with the Bible John description. The scripture, the suit, the taxi ride. Critics now argue that the police, under immense pressure, lumped 3 separate domestic tragedies together to create a serial killer narrative. It is easier to hunt one monster than 3. Maybe the man in the taxi, the real Bible John, was just a weird, religious guy who dropped Helen off and went home. Maybe the actual killer was someone waiting in the shadows of Earl Street. Maybe the witness, Jean Langford, was so traumatized that her memory created a caricature. This theory suggests that the phantom we have been hunting for 50 years is a construct, a ghost story invented by a terrified city and a desperate police force. And if that is true, then there is not one killer walking free. There could be 3. The Grave of Secrets. On October 8, 2022, an 86-year-old man took his last breath in a hospital bed in Edinburgh. He was chained to the bed frame, a frail shadow of the monster he once was. That man was Peter Tobin. For years, detectives and families had waited for a deathbed confession. They hoped that as the darkness closed in, Tobin would finally admit to being the man in the suit, the man who quoted Moses in a taxi in 1969. But Tobin remained defiant to the end. When asked about Bible John, he reportedly sneered, "I'm not Bible John. I'm Peter Tobin." With his death, the most promising lead in 50 years turned to ash. The DNA evidence from the 1996 exhumation of John Irvine McInnes was inconclusive. The samples from the original crime scenes have degraded beyond use. The witnesses are gone. The detectives have retired or passed away. The uncomfortable truth. So, was the case solved? Legally no. Bible John remains unmasked. There is no mugshot, no conviction, no closure. However, many modern investigators and criminologists believe the answer lies in the messy reality of the myth theory. The prevailing modern view is a disturbing one. Bible John might not be one man. It is highly probable that Peter Tobin killed at least one of the women. His modus operandi fits perfectly with the rape and strangulation of Jemima MacDonald. But the man in the taxi, the eloquent, Bible-quoting John Templeton, who killed Helen Puttock, might have been a completely different predator. The police, desperate to quell the panic of a city under siege, may have inadvertently stitched together 3 separate tragedies into one legendary monster. In doing so, they created a phantom that could never be caught because he never truly existed in the way we imagined. The legacy of the lost. The true resolution of this story is not about the killer. It is about the city he changed forever. The Barrowland Ballroom still stands today. The neon sign still flickers above the Gallows Gate, casting a nostalgic glow over Glasgow. Bands still play, and people still dance. But the innocence of 1969 is gone. The dancing murders forced a generation of women to look over their shoulders. It shattered the illusion that nice men in suits were safe. It taught Glasgow that the devil does not always look like a monster. Sometimes he looks like a gentleman who offers to walk you home. The final haunting. If you walk down Earl Street in Scotstoun tonight, the tenements look much the same as they did 50 years ago. The fog still rolls in off the River Clyde. Somewhere out there, perhaps in a nursing home, perhaps in a grave, or perhaps walking freely among us, is a man who knows the truth. A man who knows why he quoted the Bible. A man who knows why he took the handbags. Until that truth is revealed, Bible John remains Scotland's Jack the Ripper, A ghost story whispered in the dark, a shadow in the corner of the ballroom, waiting for the music to stop.